Good afternoon. I'm Jeffrey Herbst, President of American Jewish University, and welcome to a very special discussion with Admiral Michael Mullen on the wars in the Middle East. But first, welcome to another program brought to you by the Office of Open Learning of American Jewish University. Since the beginning of the pandemic, we've brought you over 200 programs that have been watched by tens of thousands of people. We hope you'll join us often and visit our website at www.aju.edu to see our exciting upcoming programs, including one on Monday, June 10th at 11 a.m. Pacific Daylight Time on Israel's war in Syria. We also hope that you'll consider supporting AJU. You'll see in your chat function a link to our donate page. These programs are free, but of course they come at a cost. And we hope that you'll continue to support us generously as you have in the past. Today, it's a pleasure to welcome to our platform Admiral Michael Mullen. Admiral Mullen served for the U.S. Navy for 43 years, and as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was the nation's highest-ranking military officer for 4 years. He also served as Chief of Naval Operations and in many other distinguished posts. During his term as chair, U.S. forces were actively engaged in combat in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, among other places. Admiral, welcome to AJU's platform.
Thank you, Jeff. It's good to be with you.
Admiral, I know that much of the modern Navy was shaped by the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. And I know you've given throughout your career much thought to strategic surprise. How do you understand the Israelis being surprised by their own admissions by the attack of Hamas on October 7th and the amount of damage Hamas was able to do?
Well, I mean, in one way, it's an easy answer in these times for me because I view what's happened politically in Israel to be such a dominant force, and we shouldn't forget the many protests by literally hundreds of thousands of Israelis on the whole issue of the Supreme Court and the justice system, which had distracted or certainly focused, depending on probably how you look at this, had distracted or focused the leadership, because that's clearly what the Netanyahu and others were focused on. And I haven't done the exact timing of this, Jeffrey, but if I were to go back from that into the numbers of elections that have occurred in Israel in the last 2 or 3 years, so the political focus, movement, and distraction has been significant, and it is driven, and this isn't just going on obviously in Israel. Clearly, we have our own version of that going on right here in the United States right now, and many other countries. And in that, I think that the Netanyahu in particular was able to set up a situation where he could focus on continuing to move the politics and the outcomes in Israel to the right, and then almost beneath that, and in doing that, create a comfort level that it was all kind of be okay. And going through Qatar, I can't remember how many years ago it was where the PLA basically, or the Palestinian Authority, the PA, said we're not going to pay the bill anymore for Gaza, and Netanyahu, as I understand it, went to Qatar, and Qatar has been funneling money in there for a long time, and very clearly they took their eye off the ball, and in having their eye off the ball, focused on these other areas, which are so politically strong and emotional. And then in that, I think there was a complacency that comes with that. And all this, I think, will at some point in time be laid bare, with investigations about what really happened, which then opened the door. I think there's a lot of accounts right now that even Hamas was surprised. They lasted so long in Israel. It was a half a day before they received any resistance, and that they were able to penetrate so far and take so many hostages. And oh, by the way, other groups that were associated with Hamas were able to come in and take hostages as well, which Hamas doesn't control as they do control themselves. So what is in the center of that, though, is also this question, because I know the IDF and I know the intelligence agencies in Israel very well, in my time. And even given all that, it's just a stunning miss. And it has so unsettled the Israeli people. It has so unsettled the region, and in a way, it's unsettled the world. And getting back to some sense of deterrence and some sense of security for the Israeli people is really going to be a tough run.
I'll be talking with Admiral Mullen for about 25 minutes, and then we welcome questions from you, the audience. Please put your questions starting now in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I'll try to get to as many as possible. Admiral, how do you assess Israel's military campaign in Gaza since October 7th?
When October 7th occurred, within a day or two, there were a couple of thoughts that I had. One, they're going to kill every Hamas leader and take them off the face of the earth. I know the Israeli leadership. I know the IDF well. I know my counterparts, one of whom is Benny Gantz, and I have an understanding about the Middle East where they will eliminate them. Secondly, I worried a great deal at the time about whether it would expand dramatically, and it seemed to be going in that direction for a while. And now we're seemingly at a point where it is somewhat contained, although I honestly don't, I'm not going to rest on that. That's still a worry. And then thirdly, I think this is all about Iran. It's all, to me anyway, it was all about the proximity of Israel doing a deal with Saudi Arabia, having done that with Bahrain and UAE, with more to follow. So it was clearly to disrupt that. And my reaction to that was then, we're going to have to do something about Iran. We've been not doing enough with Iran for 45 years. They're not going to change their behavior. And this has actually put them in a pretty significantly better position strategically than they were before Hamas went in. And then so also what I've learned about the Middle East is there is a vengeance or revenge, almost a passion that disregards the enemy as human beings. And so some of that to me is in play with the massive destruction that has occurred in Gaza, and the thousands and thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of innocents who've been killed. And if you know Gaza at all, the likelihood of that not happening was very slim, just because it's so packed. And Israel had an enormous amount of support globally on day one. What my hope was, an expectation that it would dissipate over time, but I hoped that it would last longer than it did. And I think the campaign itself dissipated that goodwill, if you will, very rapidly. And that's kind of where we are right now. So my own view is that this is a campaign that should have been more deliberate, more focused, more very precise on the Hamas leadership. I think they also ran into a tremendously difficult structure in these tunnels, much more than anyone knew or anticipated, and they're still there today. And then again, it did bring this disunified country under Netanyahu together in this unity government. And all aspects of this unity government approved the plan. So it's not just, it's just not the prime minister. It's just not Netanyahu at all. And I think it's going to be difficult to recover from that for a long time.
Let's talk about one of the issues you raised, which is very much central in a lot of people's concerns: civilian casualties in the Gaza campaign. The Biden administration has said that there have been too many. The Israelis say their ratios of combatants to civilians is quite good, while noting that civilians have been killed. What's your assessment of the civilian casualties and the type of warfare that the Israelis are fighting?
The most difficult warfare in the world, this block to block, house to house warfare. Certainly, we learned that in both Iraq and Afghanistan, and most challenging for lots of reasons. The civilian casualties, sadly, always occur in war. What I think all of us have to understand better is the cameras are on in war now like they never have been. And taking that into consideration in terms of some level of acceptance of killing women and children, I just don't think, I think it's different from what it used to be. And we need to strategize in a way, integrating that thought in terms of how we carry out warfare. That would argue with what I said, I think should have been done for a more deliberate, more painstaking, more time than anybody wanted, certainly from a time standpoint, to prosecute a campaign like this. And with as much goodwill as Israel had early, almost could you create the strategic view that we could improve on that over time because of the way we actually carry out this war? And obviously that was not the case. So it's just it's going to be, I think it's going to be a long road back for Israel, for the leadership and for Israel in terms of the devastation in this. I personally don't accept that the ratio is acceptable. It's just too many.
Admiral, some Israelis and others claim that the focus on civilian casualties has been greater than when the U.S. was fighting in Fallujah, Raqqa, and elsewhere. Is that fair?
That's probably fair. That's probably fair in the sense that certainly those campaigns didn't last as long as this. They were a little bit more out of sight and out of mind globally, and wouldn't have received that kind of video, if you will, that was clearly evident from day one here because of what Hamas had done initially. So all eyes were on. There was no question about that. I struggle. This is, obviously we, the U.S., have supplied a lot of weapons, and I'm very supportive of that and very supportive of getting it right, helping get it right for Israel. But as a military leader that understands what a 2,000-pound bomb does, I don't get that. I can't get, you can't in a geography and in the confinement and in the packed buildings and places in Gaza that are there, you can't land. You can't precisely shoot a 2,000-pound bomb without killing an awful lot of people that are in addition to those you're trying to get at. So again, I would argue for more time, and there are probably those that would say, hey, we didn't have a lot of time, but that's where I am.
Admiral, what do you think victory looks like for the Israelis in Gaza?
First of all, it's for them to decide, not me, not us. I think that's really important. And that goes back to what I believe they've lost, which is this deterrence and security comfort, if you will, that they had prior to October 7th. As in all conflicts, it's going to end at some point. I think it probably has some aspects to it where they can feel secure. I don't think Hamas would certainly not be running Gaza in the future. I know this is one of the eternal struggles. Is I personally believe there's got to be a two-state outcome here. I think the longer this goes, the harder that gets, but I think that's the long-term solution. And with some, again, I think pretty significant support from the US and others to mitigate the proxies, the Hezbollahs, the Houthis, the Syrians, and create a much more secure environment in the longer run, and where Hamas is no longer a threat. I know that Israeli leadership has used the word destroy. I mean, something I learned with Al Qaeda and other terrorist organizations. You can't destroy an idea. You're not going to make that go away, but you can certainly greatly diminish them to a point where they're no longer a serious threat. And I think that has to be part of the outcome as well.
Well, let's shift a little bit to the Houthis and U.S. naval engagement, arguably the largest naval engagement since World War II. So right now we have billion-dollar destroyers with million-dollar interceptors knocking down drones that cost a few $1,000s that have disrupted shipping in a significant maritime theater for especially Europe and Asia.
Sure.
Is the solution here to continue to just knock these drones and missiles down, or is there some other way of playing offense?
Well, I think in the interim we have to basically keep doing what we're doing. I mean, when you say that, and I get it, $2 million missile knocking down a $50,000 drone, but you gotta knock them down, and they've been incredibly successful at doing that, even with some of the engagements being very, very close calls. And I think that has to continue. There are a couple of thoughts, Jeff. One is I go back to 9/11 for us. The amount of money that was spent on that by Al Qaeda to carry out that terrorist act was, pennies on the dollar in terms of what we have spent since that time. So in many ways, I don't want to excuse that, but in many ways, when you're dealing with terrorist organizations, you're sort of dealing with that kind of ratio. That doesn't mean we should continue to do it. We ought to develop other weapons that are much less expensive that can have an impact on this, although that's when you're looking at the not even tens of them, hundreds of them, that can become a real challenge. I mean, I was really taken back by the number of weapons that were flown in that attack from Iran on Israel. The reported number is over 300. It's a stunning number of weapons, drones, missiles, etc. And quite frankly, to be able to have the kind of success against that is also a stunning outcome. But the other example I use, and I was involved heavily in the pirates off of Somalia, we're not going to win this thing at sea. We might be able to take them out at sea and take the pirates out at sea, but you're going to have to go ashore to fix what's going on with the Houthis. And what's scary about that is it wasn't just Iranian giving the Houthis weapons. The Houthis were manufacturing some of these weapons themselves and will probably continue to do that. Now, I say that having spent a fair amount of time in Yemen, not in it, but I'm certainly focused on Yemen myself. That is an extraordinarily difficult, complex country that is, wide open spaces. It's ungoverned in many, many ways. But I don't really think we get at the Houthis like we have to, we'll need to, unless we go ashore in some fashion to stop them there.
I'll be talking with the Admiral for about 5 or 10 more minutes, and then we welcome questions from you, the audience. Please keep them coming through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Someone said recently that a precept of American foreign policy across administrations has been that Iran can attack anyone, but no one can attack Iran.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
Well, certainly, if I were to look at it, and one of the things I try to do when I try to figure out a strategy, if I don't understand a strategy, is say, what's happened? What have we executed? And if I were to look at it from that perspective, That's happened clearly because nobody has attacked Iran, and that's worked pretty well for Iran, even though I know, and this goes to that 300 missile drone attack. I've never been overly impressed with Iranians' military capability. Now, the whole issue of them developing nuclear weapons is, that takes it to an entirely different level, and much of the effort in the last 20, 25, 30 years has been to try to prevent them from gaining that capability. And that's been the main focus. And I think if they had that, it would be a disaster and dangerous for lots of reasons, because I don't think they'd be the only end up being the only nuclear power in the Middle East. And the Middle East is enough of a challenge without adding nuclear weapons. But I am counseled by what Iran did when we went into Iraq in 2003, which they really sobered up quickly. They literally thought they were going to be next, and they pulled back fairly significantly. Certainly, they stopped their nuclear weapons program from being developed at the time. We've been concerned on the conventional side for years now about this increased missile capability that they've had. Well, that didn't function very well other than volume in the attack the other day on Israel, which gets back to I'm not overly impressed or overly worried about their conventional military. That said, they are masters of the universe in the proxy world. That's why that's got to be addressed. And you're talking to somebody that's been in too many Middle East wars and would not suggest that we should get into another one. But I would suggest, as I said early, we're going to have to do something about Iran. And I don't mean necessarily attack them, but we're going to have to put more pressure on them from every single direction that we possibly can over a long period of time to get them to a point where they cease the kind of terrorist activity that they foster, actually globally, not just in the region.
General Kenneth McKenzie, who's retiring as CENTCOM commander, recently wrote an article in The Atlantic. He, of course, executed the assassination of Iranian General Soleimani, saying that Americans didn't understand the utility of force against Iran. Is that your assessment?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure I'd say we don't understand it. I think it's where you take the risks. I don't know that I would use that phrase. We clearly haven't taken the risk associated with striking them per se. And I know Soleimani. No, I didn't know Soleimani myself, but I certainly know his background. He was there when I was there. And I thought that was a really critical strike because he was a brilliant strategic and tactical leader, the elimination of whom has had I believe, a significant impact on Iran in terms of their overall development of their overall capability and strategy. But I think that, that's a question that's out there. Should we, and again, we've been through an awful lot of pain in the wars in the Middle East. So I think getting into another war is something that we need to give great consideration to every aspect because of what war in the Middle East, what war with Iran would mean. And the other thing that's changed in the last 20 years is they clearly are more aligned with Russia, China, Venezuela, North Korea than they were 10, 15, 20 years ago. So they have friends where they didn't have that kind of support before to the degree that they have it now. And that's another consideration.
And let's widen the focus a little bit. Biden administration, it's been noted, has denied the Ukrainians kind of weapon system after weapon system only a few months later to agree to provide it. The Israelis say that the Biden administration opposed all their moves until they actually did them. Is the administration asking these countries to play for a tie in what they see as existential struggles?
No, I don't think so. I think what the administration is trying to do is avoid another war in the Middle East. I talked about the my second worry the day after October 7th was, would this expand? And as I've read publicly, because I don't know, I don't see the intelligence. Obviously Hezbollah has been somewhat restrained. The Houthis have been somewhat of a surprise. And the strikes, even the strikes back from Iran, have been fairly calculated, seemingly to not escalate. And I think that if I again looking at execution as a strategy, I think the Biden administration's strategy has been one not to escalate, in particular not to escalate with Russia, and particularly not to escalate with Russia and the potential use of nuclear weapons. And I have thought for the last decade plus that Putin's the most dangerous guy on earth. I think that will continue to be the case. And I wouldn't put it past him to use a tactical nuclear weapon, even though from a battlefield standpoint, it probably wouldn't have that much impact, assuming he was used in a battlefield, not a city. And that takes warfare in the world to just a whole new level. So I think that the Biden administration is now more comfortable that he won't do that, even though I wouldn't put it past him to do it. And now, therefore, more supportive of just the change the other day that allowed the Ukrainians to use U.S. weapons to go inside Russia for some targets. What I think will be mostly on the border, but that's a change. And in the long run, when this is reviewed by historians, the administration may get criticized for that. But the front end of this, making sure we didn't get into any kind of nuclear war with Russia, I think was a valid concern.
One last question from me, then we'll go to questions from the audience.
Sure.
Since the Obama administration, U.S. has been talking about the pivot to Asia, get resources, including military resources, out of the Middle East, focusing on the emerging and accelerating threat from China.
Yeah.
Has all this since October 7th made that kind of pivot impossible?
You probably wouldn't know this, I was a basketball player in my youth. And so when I listened to the Obama administration talk about pivots, I heard from my friends in Israel, in Europe, and in the Middle East is sort of, what are we, chopped liver kind of thing. One. Secondly, we didn't move that many forces. We may have said it, but rhetorically we said it, but we just certainly early on, even the Obama administration, we just didn't move that many resources there. And I've been to China, where they would say to me when I brought this up, the pivot issue comes up, and they would say, we don't understand, because we still got the same amount of forces surrounding us as we used to. What does this mean? That said, I believe that Taiwan is the most dangerous place on earth, existential to us and actually to the global economy, for lots of specific reasons. And I've actually spent a fair amount of time trying to study that and understand it. That's the only conflict that I think could get us into a world war, global war with China. I believe for a long time, not just Xi Jinping, but any Chinese president, if they thought they were going to lose Taiwan, they would not let that be part of their legacy, and that they would go to war to protect it and then figure out the aftermath. So we have to do all we can to prevent that from happening. We have to literally, in my view, keep it as the status quo, let this be reconciled peacefully, and not go to war. That's the most dangerous, I think, least likely right now, but most dangerous possible outcome in the world. In addition, obviously, we're supporting a war in Europe, and we've had the war now since last October in the Middle East. Honestly, I think we're pretty thin. I'm one now that would argue our defense budget, and I've not argued for this in the past, that it has to go up a lot. And I get $840 billion, which is the proposal I think that's on the Hill right now for 25, is a lot of money. We can't do it at 840. I think it's going to have to be up around $1 trillion. And before I was a policy guy, when I was chairman, basically what I did was money and programming. So I've got a decent background there. I don't think we can do it. And I worry about Jeff, the simultaneity of these three things right now, China, Ukraine, Russia, and Hamas, and Iran, and back to strategy, how do you get at something like this? I think you have to disrupt the simultaneity of it to make sure that all three don't keep bubbling like they are. And maybe, just maybe, it's gotten a little better with China since Biden and Xi met in San Francisco in November. But I don't trust Xi Jinping. I think Xi Jinping's out to run the world. And I think we need to be a lot stronger and a lot more deterrent focused on China as well. So I think the pivot needs to happen, or at least the buildup needs to happen. And we've only got finite resources, so where are you going to get them? Which also argues we need the war in Europe to end, and we need the war, in my view, the war in the Middle East to end as well.
Admiral, let's go to some questions from the audience, and there are a lot. I'll try to get to as
Sure.
many as possible. First, echoing a lot of people in the audience, getting back to our earlier conversation, what should, audience member writes, the IDF do about Hamas fighting in schools with civilians?
I just think you have to be incredibly precise and deliberate to take out the leadership and to go after and down to a very, very relatively low level inside Hamas. That's going to take more time than anybody wants. I worry a great deal about the hostages and the state. I'm not surprised as I see these reports, very sad, tragic outcomes for 2 or 3 hostages at a time. And I haven't, from my perspective, if the hostages are returned, Hamas loses an awful lot of its leverage, if not all of it. So it's hard for me to believe they're just going to that they're going to make a deal and return the hostages, just in sort of a pause kind of situation. So I think you have to be more precise and take your time. We've been dealing with terrorists hiding behind women and children since 9/11. And they will continue to do that, to use them as shields. And I think we have to adjust accordingly. I think it's all, and part of warfare is, again, sadly, it's not going to be zero. And zero civilian casualties, but we have to do everything we can to minimize that. So it takes good intel. It takes a very deliberate, well thought through campaign, very precise and accurate targeting to go after Hamas. And I haven't seen a lot of reports, Jeff, on how much Hamas has been devastated. I don't see much of that. I have seen Netanyahu talk about, these last battalions down in Rafah, and that should do it. But I haven't really seen any really specific details on how much Hamas has been deteriorated, how deteriorated from a capability standpoint Hamas is.
Admiral, when we talk about more precise, longer, more involved tactics, does that inevitably mean more IDF casualties and fatalities?
Yes, I think clearly the longer you're at war, that would be the case. I don't, depends on obviously what kind of campaign you generate now. I mean, most of the IDF forces are out, but if you go back in numbers, that's obviously, you could make it a lot shorter, but the numbers of casualties could go up fairly dramatically. So I think, that's, as far as I'm concerned, obviously you want to minimize that if you're a fighting force, but there's an understanding from, of those of us who fight, that part of what we do is we put our lives on the line, and sadly, those lives are lost, certainly in warfare. But that's different, from my point of view, than the innocent civilians that get wiped out in the numbers of tens of thousands, which is what's happened.
Admiral, another member of the audience writes, how big is the threat of Hezbollah in the north? And do you expect the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah to turn into a full-blown war?
I think it's very significant. I think, at least from what I've read, in terms of Hezbollah being a threat. Secondly, they're a lot better than they were in 2006. I mean, a lot of people are saying that, so I accept that. I don't know that for a fact. And at this point, and some of this is conditioning based on what's happened since October 7th, that there are constraints placed either by Nasrallah, who heads up Hezbollah, or the Iranians, or both, on what Hezbollah can do. So right now, I don't expect that to break out into a full-fledged war. I would worry, because I've been on a couple fronts. I've fought 2 wars at a time. I would worry a great deal about fighting on 2 fronts. That doesn't mean the IDF couldn't handle it, but that becomes another huge, huge challenge. And the IDF's a lot, I think, the Hezbollah has got much more capability than Hamas has.
Admiral, another member of the audience refers to what you were saying before, and one of the bewildering things to many people is the role of Qatar and all of this.
Yeah.
I know you've been there a lot, worked with leadership. Can you explain its role and what it wants, and how vital is it to U.S. interests?
One of the things I learned in the Middle East wars, in the wars that I was involved in, is many, many countries in that part of the world, they play it on both sides of the coin. And I think Qatar has done that certainly since we went into Iraq, and they've been remarkably supportive of the United States in our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, particularly Afghanistan. I think they have tried to play, the negotiator role. I mean, I can work, or I can focus on what happened, at the end game for Afghanistan for us, just as an example. They have a relationship and have had a long-standing relationship with Iran. They have a voice through Al Jazeera, which is powerful. I think they've moderated a great deal since they first sort of came out publicly after the Iraq War, moved from being as supportive of Iran as they were back then to where they are right now. So while I didn't know about what the Israeli leadership had done, funneling the money through, I just wasn't paying attention, funneling the money to support Hamas and support Gaza through Qatar. I wasn't surprised. I'm not surprised. Again, in the long run, I think we'll find out more about the details on that, particularly reading lately that obviously Hamas has peeled off a lot of that money that was supposed to go to the Palestinians in Gaza, for weapons and capability. And obviously we, including Israel, weren't keeping a very close eye on that. So I'm not surprised at what Qatar's doing. I expect they'll try to do it in the future as well.
Admiral, a couple of different members of the audience ask about the relationship between war on the ground and the PR battles that are fought across the world. You said that in some ways, some of the wars you fought had less scrutiny than what Israel is doing now. How do you, having been a veteran and thinking about war in the future, how do you understand this other theater of public relations, the internet, social media, and its relationship to war fighting?
It's almost a front unto itself. I mean, I'm a 60s kid. I'm a Vietnam vet. I was watching Vietnam come into my home in the 60s with Walter Cronkite, the first time that a war sort of got filmed and was presented to the American people, obviously not live, but certainly relatively speaking, it was almost live, and look to where it is right now. And in the wars that I'm talking about in Iraq and Afghanistan, those were, at times, they were intensely focused and very, very much alive. When you asked about Fallujah and Ramadi, those were not highly focused externally. from a PR standpoint initially, but certainly became that afterwards. I just think, you know, we leaders have to take this into consideration as they make decisions, because populations around the world get to vote, and that's important. So as I said, there's got to be, I don't even want to say an annex, there's got to be a chapter in the plan that handles the public relations media aspect of this war and all wars, I think, going into the future.
Admiral, we have time for one more question. Member of the audience writes about two-state solution, which you briefly referenced.
Yeah.
What does it mean to have a demilitarized Palestinian state? And is that plausible?
I guess a mark that I would put on the ground is peaceful, and from a capability standpoint, first of all, peaceful Palestinian state. Secondly, from just a military capability standpoint, have it well inside what I would call the restored security comfort of the Israeli people. So something like this could never happen again, and that the Israeli people and the Israeli leadership has that comfort level to some degree, almost by themselves, with an expectation that the US and others may help. But that deterrence that I talked about, that security which has been shattered, those are restored, and that there's no possible way for a Palestinian state to disturb that. And that's a far reach from, obviously, from where we are right now. And that somehow, and I don't know how we do this, but somehow Hamas, again, is defeated, and cannot bring any kind of military capability wherever it is, for the Palestinians, in spite of the Palestinians, that Hamas has basically gotten to a point where they're no longer a threat.
Admiral Michael Mullen, former chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, thank you so much for talking with us today.
Thanks, Joe.
And thank you to you, the audience. We're delighted that you joined us. We have an exciting range of programs coming up, which you can see on our website, www.aju.edu. We'd appreciate your support for this programming, because there are so many important issues to explore. So, Admiral Mullen, thank you very much. Thank you to the audience. Look forward to seeing you again on AJU's Open Learning Platform.